Did you know that the average person actually spends nearly half of their waking hours mind-wandering, daydreaming, or just consuming some form of fiction? It's wild to think about. So let's just jump right into this explainer on the architecture of escapism and the really fascinating psychology behind why so many of us prefer fantasy over reality. We're going to explore exactly how we build these intricate mental structures, why we retreat into them so often, and ultimately what that really says about our everyday lives.
I mean, let's start by looking right in the mirror and acknowledging a feeling I think we all share. Why is reality so often the very last place we want to be? Think about the heavy psychological weight of modern life for a second. We aren't just dealing with basic chores or traffic anymore. We're navigating constant hyperconnectivity, that endless doom scrolling through negative news cycles, and the literal nonstop ping of notifications demanding our immediate attention. It's exhausting, right? It results in immense decision fatigue. So that desire to just hit a mental pause button on all the chaotic friction of the real world and step into a different, much more accommodating universe, that is a profound, deeply ingrained human instinct. And that brings us to a foundational excerpt from our source text, The Psychology of People Who Prefer Fantasy Over Reality, which really sets the blueprint for today's analysis. The text frames reality as a state of incredibly high cognitive load. The author points out that reality is essentially an environment of unrelenting psychological demands, noting that stress and anxiety are constant companions in a world we just can't predict or control. Because of that, retreating into fantasy isn't some sort of glitch in our mental software. It's actually a highly evolved, calculated solution. Our minds don't just sit there and passively endure chronic stress, they actively engineer escape hatches to help preserve our sanity. Let's move right into section 1, the allure of escapism. Okay, so escapism is defined here as the psychological practice of seeking distraction and relief from unpleasant realities, often through immersion in fantasy. Now, I want you to really focus on two specific words here: practice and relief. This is an active, deliberate process. Before we can truly understand why someone prefers fantasy, we have to recognize that this is a world away from just passively staring out a window. It's a highly calculated mental pivot. Just consider the intense dedication of someone meticulously planning out a sprawling 80-hour Dungeons & Dragons campaign. They aren't just killing time. That is the active practice of architecting a manageable, rule-bound world to offset the completely unmanageable stress of, say, a looming corporate restructuring at their day job. Moving on to section 2, the architecture of fantasy. Think about the absolute massive contrast between these two states of being. On one hand, reality is chaotic, unpredictable, and stressful. You simply cannot control the global economy, sudden health emergencies, or honestly, even the weather. But fantasy is structured, controllable, and grand. When you completely immerse yourself in the deep lore of Tolkien's Middle-earth, or maybe you master the strict, predictable mechanics of a video game like Stardew Valley or Elden Ring, you are entering a space governed by absolute rules. There's a specific cause and effect. There are distinct heroes, solvable problems, and predictable outcomes. These constructed worlds are literally architectural marvels of the human mind, designed specifically to provide the order that our daily existence so often lacks. Which brings us to section 3, the psychology behind the escape. So what's actually driving this under the hood? Well, the psychological drivers of escapism are rooted in relieving everyday stress, combating mundane boredom, and, most importantly, regaining a sense of personal control. Fantasy acts as this massive pressure release valve for our overloaded nervous systems. It also gives us that high-level cognitive stimulation our brains absolutely crave when reality just feels dull. But the pursuit of personal control, what psychologists call autonomy and self-efficacy, that is the true engine running this whole thing. Imagine a middle manager who spends 40 hours a week being micromanaged, totally bogged down in bureaucracy with zero agency over their own work. That psychological need to feel impactful, it doesn't just vanish. So what do? They boot up a role-playing game where they are the sole savior of an entire galaxy. In that world, their choices actually have weight. They have ultimate agency. Let's actually walk step by step through how this transition happens, because it's fascinating. First, you experience a lack of control in reality. Let's say you've just received a deeply frustrating email from a client that completely derails your entire week. Boom, that creates acute psychological friction. Step 2, your brain actively seeks out a structured, controllable narrative to soothe that friction. So you reach for your favorite sci-fi novel. Step 3 is the crucial bridge. You psychologically detach from real-world stressors. It's that precise moment the anxiety about that awful client email finally starts to fade into the background. And finally, step 4. You enter and fully immerse in the fantasy world. Understanding the sequence is absolutely vital because it proves that escapism isn't random. It's a sequential, highly effective coping mechanism seamlessly executed by your brain.
Next up, let's look at section 4, healthy versus unhealthy escapism.
You see, this psychological tool exists on a very sharp, double-edged spectrum. You've got healthy refuge on one side and maladaptive avoidance on the other. Healthy refuge is escapism functioning exactly as intended. It provides temporary stress relief, allows your cognitive load to reset, and can genuinely boost your creativity. It's essentially a much-needed mental vacation. Maladaptive avoidance, however, is where the architectural structure really starts to crack. It becomes an unhealthy detachment aimed at entirely avoiding real-world problems. The stressful bills are still piling up, real-life relationships might be fracturing, but instead of engaging, the individual just stays locked in the fantasy loop. They might neglect sleep, personal health, or their career just to maintain that illusion of control. At this stage, the fantasy isn't a vacation anymore. It has become a barricade.
And finally, section 5, returning to reality.
The really big takeaway here is that escapism is a spectrum, not a binary trait. Preferring fantasy isn't inherently a bad thing. It's a built-in feature of human consciousness. The absolute key to mastering it is recognizing exactly where you fall on that spectrum at any given moment. To do this, you kind of have to ask yourself a few diagnostic questions, like, does retreating into this book or this game make me more prepared to handle tomorrow or less? Am I using this fantasy to rest and recharge my batteries, or am I using it to hide from a conversation I am terrified of having? Being fiercely honest with yourself about those answers completely changes the way you manage your emotional resilience and your overall mental health. So, I want to leave you with this final thought. How will you architect your own balance between the necessary refuge of fantasy and the demands of reality? You are the master builder of your own mental environment, and the blueprints are entirely in your hands. Take a closer look at the worlds you build for yourself and ensure they are actually helping you live a stronger, more balanced, real life. Thanks so much for diving into this explainer with me.